Ava Carter had mastered the art of keeping her emotions hidden. Years of waiting tables had taught her how to smile through exhaustion, how to swallow disappointment, how to pretend she didn't notice when customers barely looked at her. To them, she was just the waitress, the one who refilled their coffee, scribbled down their orders, and disappeared into the background. But today felt different. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness pressing against her chest. Maybe it was the exhaustion of another double shift. Maybe it was the gnawing regret that whispered in her mind every time she glanced at the old audition flyer still tucked in her locker. Or maybe it was just another day of feeling unseen. The door chimed, and Ava instinctively turned toward the entrance. At first, she didn't think much of the man who walked in. Just another older customer, dressed in a worn leather jacket, his face weathered by time. He moved with quiet confidence like someone who had nothing to prove. But there was something about him, something familiar. She grabbed a menu and made her way over, pen poised. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you something to drink?" Then he looked up. Ava's breath hitched, her grip tightened on the notepad. She knew that face. Everyone did. Clint Eastwood. Right here, sitting in her section. Her pulse hammered in her ears, but she forced herself to stay professional. She had served celebrities before, and this was LA after all, but there was something about him, something in the way he studied her as if he saw straight through the mask she wore every day. And she had no idea that in just a few minutes he would leave her a note that would shatter her composure completely, a note that would change everything. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Now, let's get started. Ava's hands still trembled slightly as she jotted down his order. She told herself it was nothing. Just another customer, just another morning. But the feeling in her chest said otherwise. There was something surreal about serving a man whose movies had been playing in her living room since childhood, whose deep, commanding voice had once echoed from her father's old television set. But none of that mattered now. She was here, in this diner, wearing a faded uniform and an exhausted smile, while the dreams she once held so tightly slipped further and further from her grasp. The clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation surrounded her, but Ava barely heard any of it. The weight of years spent waiting tables pressed against her shoulders, each shift a reminder of the life she had planned but never lived. She had come to Los Angeles for something bigger, for the stage, for the spotlight, for the chance to tell stories that mattered. But the reality of rent, bills, and rejection letters had chipped away at her ambition until all that remained was survival. She forced herself to move, to shake off the creeping sadness as she poured his coffee. The diner was busy, but the loneliness inside her was louder. Every interaction felt rehearsed, every smile a mask. The customers came and went, their lives moving forward while hers remained stuck in the same exhausting loop. But when she returned to the corner booth, something in Clint Eastwood's eyes made her pause. He wasn't just another customer, wasn't just looking through her like so many others did. His gaze held something different. Something that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. And she had no idea that in just a few moments he would hand her a note that would make her world come crashing down. Ava tried to shake the uneasy feeling settling in her chest as she placed the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. She was used to customers barely acknowledging her, used to blending into the background. But Clint Eastwood wasn't like the others. He wasn't distracted by his phone or impatiently tapping his fingers against the table. Instead, he studied her, really studied her, like he was trying to read something beyond her tired smile. "You've been here long?" His voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that made Ava hesitate. 6 years, she admitted before she could stop herself. She wasn't sure why she answered so honestly. Most people didn't ask, and even if they did, she'd usually brush it off with a half-hearted joke about chasing the glamorous life of waitressing. But this time, the words came out raw, unfiltered, like a confession she hadn't meant to make. Clint nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. And is this where you want to be? The question hit harder than she expected. It wasn't laced with pity or judgment. It was just real. And for a second, the walls she had built so carefully around herself cracked. Ava opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to lie, to say something easy, something that wouldn't make her chest ache. But the truth was lodged in her throat. This wasn't where she wanted to be. This wasn't the life she had dreamed of. But dreams didn't pay bills. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's a job," she said lightly, trying to steer the conversation away. But Clint Eastwood didn't look away. He didn't nod and move on like most people did. He just held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded note. "Take this," he said, sliding it across the table. Ava hesitated. The paper felt too light in her hands, too small to hold anything that could possibly matter. But when she unfolded it and read the words inside, her heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred. And before she even realized it, tears were spilling down her cheeks. Ava's hands trembled as she clutched the note, her eyes scanning the words over and over as if reading them again might somehow change their meaning. But the message was clear, simple, yet it carried the weight of something far greater than she could comprehend in that moment. Don't give up on yourself. You have more inside you than this place will ever see. Her breath hitched. A lump formed in her throat, thick and unmovable. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the flood of emotions crashing into her all at once. This was Clint Eastwood, one of the greatest storytellers of all time, and he had seen something in her, in the way she carried herself, in the exhaustion behind her forced smile. How? She wanted to ask, wanted to understand, but her voice had abandoned her. The diner around her buzzed with its usual morning rush, plates clattering, conversations blending into a dull hum. But everything felt distant, muted. It was just her, the note, and the sinking realization of what it meant. Because deep down, she knew. She had spent years convincing herself that this was enough, that survival was enough, that it was safer to let go of the dream than to keep hoping for something that felt impossible. But with just a few words, Clint had unraveled every excuse she had clung to. He had seen the part of her she had tried to bury. Ava's fingers tightened around the paper, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to say something, do something. But before she could, Linda's sharp voice cut through the haze. "Ava, we need you on register, now!" She flinched. Reality came crashing back in. The dream, the possibilities, the glimmer of hope, it all slammed against the cold, hard truth of her life. This was her job. This was where she belonged. She forced herself to tuck the note into her apron pocket and turned toward the counter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't where her story was supposed to end. And as she walked away, she felt Clint's gaze lingering on her, as if he was waiting to see whether she would take the leap or let fear keep her exactly where she was. Ava spent the rest of her shift in a daze, the note burning in her pocket like a secret too big to carry. She rang up customers, refilled coffee cups, and forced smiles, but her mind kept drifting back to those words. Don't give up on yourself. It was such a simple thing, yet it shattered something inside her, something she hadn't even realized was breaking. By the time her shift ended, Clint Eastwood was gone. He had left a generous tip and a quiet impact that felt far heavier than the $20 bill on the table. Ava stood by the counter, staring at the empty booth, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name. A choice, a moment, a fork in the road she hadn't expected. She reached into her apron, her fingers brushing against the folded note. For years, she had silenced the voice inside her, the one that once burned with ambition, the one that whispered you were meant for more. But now, after so long, that voice was screaming to be heard. And then Linda's voice snapped her back. "Ava, Clock out before I have to pay you overtime." The finality in those words hit her harder than they should have. Clock out. Just another shift, another day, another piece of her dream slipping away. Number not this time. Heart pounding, she pulled out the note once more, staring at Clint's handwriting. A rush of courage, raw, terrifying, but electric, filled her chest. She didn't know what came next, didn't know if she would make it, but for the first time in years, she wasn't willing to stay stuck. Without another thought, she grabbed her bag, ripped off her name tag, and walked straight out the door. She didn't look back, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't running away from something. She was running toward it. The cold morning air hit Ava's face as she stepped outside, but she barely felt it. Her heart was pounding, her breath uneven, her hands still clutching the note like a lifeline. For so long, she had convinced herself that walking away wasn't an option, that dreams were meant for other people, not for a girl who had spent the last 6 years wiping down tables and counting tips to survive. But now, standing on the sidewalk, staring at the endless city stretching before her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It terrified her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably Linda, probably demanding to know where she had gone. For a brief moment, she almost turned around, almost let doubt creep back in. But then she saw the crumpled audition flyer peeking out from her bag, the same one she had tucked away months ago, too afraid to face another rejection. Ava exhaled slowly, unfolding the paper with trembling fingers. The date, the time, the casting director's name. It was today. Today. A battle raged inside her. She had walked away from the diner, but could she really do this? Could she face the possibility of failing? Then she looked down at Clint's words once more. "Don't give up on yourself. You have more inside you than this place will ever see." Tears welled in her eyes. Maybe this wasn't about success or failure. Maybe it was about proving to herself that she still had the courage to try. With a deep breath, Ava turned on her heel and started walking. Toward the audition, toward the unknown, toward the version of herself she had almost forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Ava sat in the dimly lit audition room, her hands gripping the edges of the script. Around her, seasoned actors waited, confident, poised, like they belonged here. And for a moment, the old doubt crept in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life by walking out of that diner? But then she thought about all the nights she had stood behind the counter, watching life pass her by. She thought about the note, about Clint Eastwood's steady gaze seeing something in her that she had long buried. You have more inside you than this place will ever see. Her name was called. A deep breath, a slow rise from the chair. Step by step she moved toward the stage, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, but her spirit steady. She delivered her lines, not just reading them, but feeling them, pouring every ounce of heartbreak, resilience, and hope into the performance. And as she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Then, applause. Ava didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she realized the lesson wasn't just about chasing a dream. It was about believing in herself again, about refusing to let fear make her small. As she stepped off the stage, a casting director smiled at her. "Where have you been hiding?" Ava smiled back, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm not hiding anymore." Ava stepped out of the audition building, the city air feeling different, lighter, fuller, like she was breathing for the first time in years. She didn't know if she had landed the role, but that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that she had taken the first step. She had chosen herself. And sometimes that was the hardest thing to do. How many of us are stuck in places that no longer serve us, convincing ourselves that our dreams are too far out of reach? How many times do we silence the voice inside that whispers, "You were meant for more"? Maybe today is the day you stop waiting. Maybe today is the day you take that first terrifying step, no matter how small, toward the life you were meant to live. Because sometimes, all it takes is one decision, one moment of courage to change everything. What's the dream you've been putting off? Let us know in the comments, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs that extra push to believe in themselves again.